Okay. Whoops. I don't know why my video's not on. There we go. Okay. So this is part one of our new chapter, um, the third chapter of Sukkah. And I have to admit that until now, I have chosen chapters that I had already taught, that I knew relatively well. This time I chose this chapter because I don't know it, and I'm going to have to teach it this summer at camp. So I'm learning alongside you, but uh I think I can do it. I'm gonna try. In any case, so our chapter is going to begin with a description of what kinds of lulavim are pasul, are invalid, and what kinds are kasher or valid. Um, and we seem to be dealing with a, a couple of different issues that might be worth just sort of laying out in advance. One of them is that is a halacha which we will sort of see the derivation of tonight, that on the first day of Sukkot, but only on the first day of Sukkot, your lulav, etrog, hadassim, your aravot, your arba minim need to belong to you. That's true only on the first day, because the first day is deoraita, the rest of the days are derabanan, they're rabbinic. The second issue is that the Torah says that your arba minim are supposed to be beautiful. That will also be an issue with some kinds of invalidity. And the third is that there maybe there we seem to be deriving it tonight, an issue in which God in general is not happy about people doing mitzvot with objects with which the same people have recently done a sin. And that's not Sukkot specific. Right, we're going to be trying to pick apart exactly why different things are invalid, at least to start with. Okay, so our mission starts. We start on 21b of Sukkah, and because 30a is extremely short and 30b is not that much longer, so our share is actually going to cross over bits of 4 different pages tonight. In general, I think we'll go back to something more normal, like half a page, like we had been doing. Okay. Lulav hagazul v'hayavesh pasul. So a lulav which is stolen or which is dried out is invalid. And dried out sounds like the sort of thing you would not even want to consider using. But keep in mind that in times before globalized transportation of fresh fruits and vegetables, it was not necessarily so easy to get a tree branch from one country to another without it degrading. So people have not always had access to lulavim that were fresh, maybe not even from this year or from last year. And at some point you did decide thing is too dried out. This isn't really a palm branch anymore. So it doesn't give us a standard, but it does say if it's dried, it doesn't work. Or if it's stolen. Oh, I'm sorry. One more issue about theft that needs to be mentioned, which I believe we have seen this before, probably last year, although I'm not sure. Which is that at some point after an object is stolen, it is acquired by the thief or whoever is at that point holding it, which is to say, at that point, the object itself belongs to its new owner, and the thief still has to pay for it if they get caught. They may also have to pay a fine, but the object itself is no longer connected to its original owner. And the Gemara is going to assume that when we say a stolen lulav, that would be even if it is no longer connected to its original owner. But we'll deal with that in more detail later. Okay, shel ashera v'shel ir hanidachat pasul. A lulav an ashera or an ir hanidachat is invalid, and ashera is a tree which is itself worshipped. as a living tree which is used as an idol. And Ir HaNidachat is a city where the entire city has been converted to idol worship. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that this never actually happened. But the theory is that if you have a city in which the entire population has been converted to idol worship, then the Torah says that you need to kill all of the residents of the city and pile all of their belongings in the central square of the city and then set the whole thing on fire. So a lulav that belonged to, I don't think it matters whether it's the city or one of the residents of the city, but it's among the stuff that needed to be burned. Yes, John. You're still muted.
Right. Yeah. So after Lot left Sodom, were there's anybody left who was not an idol worshiper?
And we don't know a lot about their religion. I think we just know they're terrible people. But that the basic idea seems to be to replicate the punishment of stone only by human hands. I think that's a reasonable description of what's going on. And the invalidity of the lulav of the Asherah or the lulav of the Ir HaNidachat seems to be that because these things need to be destroyed, they already kind of don't exist. And there's a minimum size for a lulav. You can't accomplish a minimum size if you don't exist. So they're not going to work. And we will see that in detail later. Yes, John.
If I steal your lulav and you steal it back, is it a stolen lulav for you?
I don't think so. Although it might depend on how long I wait before I steal it back. It may be that once it becomes yours and you just owe me money, it might be that at that point, if I just grab it instead of going through a court process, that is theft. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. Okay. Niktam Rosho, if the top of the pointy part on top of the lulav was cut off, or nifritzu alav, or the leaves were separated, but here separated means that they actually came all the way off. Then pasul, it's invalid because it's missing pieces. Nifridu alav kasher. On the other hand, if the leaves just spread, right, instead of looking like an unopened sprout, like the lulavs we use, if instead the leaves actually spread out so that it looks like an open palm branch, then it's still kosher. But Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Yagdenu milamala, Rabbi Yehuda says you have to tie it at the top so that the leaves stay together with the core so that it looks like it's supposed to look. Even though it had already spread, Rabbi Yehuda says you can just squish it back together again and tie it. It sounds like the original position thinks that you could just use it open. Although we will get to more discussion on that later in the chapter. Tzine harbarzel, kshero tzine harbarzel are a particular species of palm, which apparently you might have thought would not work for lulav, but they do. Lulav sheyesh bat shlosha tfachim k'dei linanea bo kasher. And a lulav that has 3 hand breadths, enough to wave it, is kosher. There's some ambiguity there about whether 3 hand breadths is enough to wave it or whether it needs 3 hand breadths plus enough to wave it. And the Gemara will deal with that when we get there. Okay, but for our Gemara this evening, we're going to be spent almost the entire time on the stolen lulav. That's going to be our focus. Okay, kapasik v'tani, loshna b'yom tov rishon v'loshna b'yom tov sheni. So the Mishnah didn't make any distinctions. It just told us the rules. It didn't distinguish between the first Yom Tov and the second Yom Tov. And a lot of times when we talk about Yom Tov Rishon and Yom Tov Sheni now, like the way we use the terms first Yom Tov, second Yom Tov, in 2025 in Sharon, Massachusetts, first Yom Tov would mean the holiday at the beginning of the holiday, and the second Yom Tov would be the holiday after Chol Hamoed. That is clearly not what we're talking about here because there's no mitzvah of lulav on Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah. So it clearly means the first and second days of that first beginning of Sukkot Yom Tov, and we're clearly operating in um, a diaspora narrative where it's obvious to everybody that you're keeping 2 days of Yom Tov, which, since they're in Babylonia, is reasonable. Although, since the Mishnah is in Israel, it's not necessarily so reasonable to expect the Mishnah to be living in that narrative.
Well, what
But
about the Yerushalmi? Like, with it, that might be a different situation, right? If
I
we're
did not look at the parallel Yerushalmi. I do not know what it says. That is a good point. Um, the truth is that the question is still an interesting question, even in Israel, because you do still take lulav on the second day of Sukkot, the third day, the fourth day, and so on through Chol Hamoed, and it is still rabbinic, and it doesn't matter if it belongs to you. Maybe it matters if it's stolen, but you can use a borrowed lulav or a rented lulav during the middle of Sukkot. It's just the vocabulary you would use to describe those days wouldn't include the word Yom Tov. Right. But it is still an interesting point that the Mishnah did not distinguish between Yom Tov and Chol Hamoed, to put it in Israeli terms. It's just that the way the Gemara describes the issue here is very diasporan, with first Yom Tov and second Yom Tov. Okay, Bishlama Yavesh. So I understand why you wouldn't make that distinction between the first day of Sukkot and the second day of Sukkot with a dried out lulav. Hadar ba'inan v'leka. You need the lulav to be beautiful. It needs to be hadar, and it's not beautiful. So it's simply, I think we could say it fails to be a lulav because it's icky. The dried out one.
This is a good, totally off topic, but maybe at the end of like practical questions about like dried up aravos and like it just happens every year.
Yeah, no, it
unfortunately
definitely happens every year, and I don't have a lot to contribute beyond that. We push the boundaries every year.
Right. Like you could technically get a new one. Like some of my friends who are really careful, they like, first of all, they keep it in the fridge and they roll it up in these
Right.
paper towels and all this stuff. But like if you don't do all of that, and then they buy new ones, like let's say they go to Israel Bookshop, they get like backup ones.
So
there
my
are ways to
experience,
avoid it, but that's just
the last time I spent Sukkot in Israel was when I was a teenager. But my experience then was we were on a kibbutz, and the kibbutz just kept a giant willow branch in a bucket of water in the doorway of the shul, and everybody replaced their aravot on the way into shul every morning for all of Sukkot.
wow.
If you happen to live on a kibbutz with an aravat tree, it works great.
I think Sharon could be more lenient because isn't it like certain mitzvahs, like if it's a very big hassle to get it,
Yeah,
then
so
you're
as
more
it happens,
this.
as it
But for
happens,
Brookline, we're right here. We're right next
so
to the
of the arba minim, aravot are the one you actually can grow fairly easily and kosher in this climate. We have the shul has aravot growing here, and we have, I think, 2 or 3 families that have in their backyard. But we still don't seem to have made it a practice for everyone to replace them every day because they're still not that available. So
Oh, but
yeah,
like every day is one
I
thing,
agree
but
it's an
also
issue.
like yeah, but like ours are somehow this year ours got completely dried out and brownish.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
wasn't like a little bit, it was like very, and I was actually strongly considering like not like either asking a rabbi, which I don't think I ended up doing, or like not shaking at all.
Yeah,
Because I
no,
was like, this is probably not even 100% kosher. I'm not sure if
it's definitely an issue, and I definitely have no expertise in it at all.
okay.
Okay.
All right, good to know.
So but so we understand why you wouldn't bother distinguishing between the different days of Sukkot with the dried out lulav, or with most of the other things that the Mishnah is talking about. But with the stolen lulav, the Gemara doesn't understand why there's no distinction. Bishlama Yom Tov Rishon, dichtiv lachem mishal lachem, because in the pasuk that commanded us to take the Arba Minim to begin with, that says Lakachtem lachem, you will take for yourselves. And we're reading that for yourselves as meaning it has to belong to you. On the first day, because we only think that that pasuk applies to normal people outside the Beit HaMikdash on the first day of Sukkot. It applies to all of Sukkot in the Beit HaMikdash, but outside the Beit HaMikdash it only applies on the first day. So Ella b'Yom Tov Sheni, but on the second day of Yom Tov, Amai why shouldn't you use somebody else's lulav? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Rabbi Yochanan's quoted Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Same person we now tend to call Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but the Gemara calls him Rabbi Shimon Ben Yochai. Mishum dehavale mitzvah haba be'avera. Because it's a mitzvah that happens by doing an avera, by doing a sin. Shinem, Aaron is the pasuk in Malachi, v'havetem gazul v'tapiseach v'tacholeh. So the prophet Malachi, and we're a little behind, so I'm not gonna read the pasuk in context, but he makes this accusation against Bnei Yisrael that they're bringing the animals they don't want anyway as their sacrifices, and he describes them as gazul, stolen, and piseach, lame, and choleh, sick. So gazul dumya de piseach. So since Malachi described the animals that were stolen in the same list as the animals that are lame, the Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, feels comfortable saying that it must be that the parameters of stolen are similar to the parameters of lame. Ma piseach le takanta. Just as once an animal is limping, is lame, that's not fixable. It's permanent. That's the state of the animal for the rest of its life. That we don't. I think we're assuming that piseach means that there's some sort of permanent damage to the animal, not that it's just like it, got a thorn in its foot and now it's limping, but tomorrow it'll be fine. I don't think we're talking about that. Av gazul le takanta. So likewise, the definition of stolen must be that once it's stolen, it stays stolen forever. Loshna lifnei yeush v'loshna la'achar yeush. It doesn't matter whether it's before or after yeush. Now, yeush is when the original owner gives up on getting it back, right? And that's a thing that we see both with lost objects and with stolen objects. At the time when the original owner gives up on trying to retrieve the object, that's when the new owner becomes the owner, right? In the case of a lost object, you become completely the new owner. It's yours because the other person isn't looking for it anymore and you didn't do anything wrong. In the case of a stolen object, the thief would then have a financial obligation to repay for what they took, but the object itself would become the personal property of whoever is at that moment holding it. Right? It gives you a sort of a statute of limitations on something being stolen property, which is what allows us to engage in commerce with people that we don't actually know where they got their stuff from. But otherwise, we could never buy anything unless it had a chain of custody that we could trust, because it might be stolen property. So this
Wait,
is very important for
I didn't
normal
understand that point.
commerce. So here's the thing.
How do we buy anything today again? Because we don't wait any time. We just buy it immediately, right?
Well, suppose that you buy a book from Amazon.
Right.
Right? You don't have any way of knowing for sure that the person you're buying it from is a legitimate owner of the book. Or for that matter, that the person that they bought it from was the legitimate owner of the book. And you don't know for sure that the printing press didn't steal the ink.
Right.
Or the person who manufactured the ink didn't steal the ingredients for the ink.
The truth is now you can research everything. You can Google it, right?
Yes, but the number of things that you need to buy in order to live your life is enough that if you had to research whether the tuna company had legitimate ownership of the celery that they used to make the broth in which they cook the tuna, you
Right.
could never go grocery shopping. Like it would be too
Right.
the amount of research you'd need to do would be too much. And historically, there was simply no way to find out about most of these things anyway. So,
Right.
but what this does is, as long as it wasn't stolen very recently, it belongs now to whoever's holding it anyway. So you can buy stuff that, as long as it doesn't appear to have been stolen like today, you can buy things in the marketplace and rely that they, at least even if they aren't supposed to belong to the person you're buying it from, they do in fact actually at the moment belong to the person you're buying it from.
Okay.
So in order for commerce to operate normally, this is very important. But apparently we're going to ignore it from the point of view of whether God is angry at you for using stolen property to do a mitzvah. Apparently, if it was ever stolen, it's no good.
A minute.
God can,
So this time thing that you mentioned, like this clause, this like legal clause, I guess you could say halachic clause. How much is that time? Is that 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 day, like any amount of time?
the problem is here or with lost objects, where it's also a concern.
Right.
That first of all, it depends on whether you want real Yeush, like the owner actually knows it's gone and has given up and moved on,
Right.
or whether you want to be able to say, well, if the owner knew it was gone, they wouldn't try to look for it.
Right.
Or you just want to say, probably in this circumstances, most owners wouldn't be looking for it. Right. So
Right.
depending on which of those things you're looking for, it's a different amount of time. We
Uh-huh.
presumably are not requiring that you actually go find the owner and ask them if they're looking for it, because that just returns us back to the mess we were in to begin with.
Right.
And so we're presumably using some kind of majority of people think of in this particular way guess about what
Right.
they would be thinking. And then it would probably depend on what kind of object it is, but most of the time, if you're buying something whose history you don't know, you can presume that if it was stolen, it was probably a while ago.
Right. So, but
Oh,
we're ignoring now the back. I didn't mean
but
to
but
cut you
but
off for the
because
main
of this
topic.
pasuk in Malachi, we're asserting that when it comes to God not liking stolen property in his worship, God's not that interested one way or the other whether the original owner is still looking for it. God doesn't want you to do a mitzvah with something that you got inappropriately,
Right.
regardless of whether it is now yours. So that's why it doesn't matter whether it's before or after Yeush. So,
Right.
Bishlama lifnei Yeush, we understand why you couldn't use a lulav before there's Yeush. I'm sorry, we're still in sacrifices. We understand why you couldn't sacrifice an animal before Yeush. Because at the very beginning of Vayikra, when it describes the possibility of bringing sacrifices, it says Adam ki akriv mikem, a person who sacrifices from yours. Amar Rahman, that's what God said. V'lav didehu, and this thing isn't yours if Yeush hasn't happened yet. Elo achar Yeush, but after Yeush, hakan be Yeush, but it became yours at the moment of Yeush, so now you should be able to sacrifice it. Elolav mishum dahavale mitzvah haba be'aver. Now this is actually the source for this is the source for God not liking mitzvot that are done by sinning. Right? Is the fact that God doesn't want you to sacrifice a stolen animal and doesn't distinguish between whether it was a stolen animal from last week or from 5 years ago or from this morning. So it seems like God doesn't actually care whether it belongs to you now, but he doesn't want you to sacrifice an animal you stole. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, and Rabbi Yochanan also said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, "My dichtiv ki ani ohev mishpat sonei gezel be'olah." Why does God say in Yeshayahu, "Because I am Hashem, who loves justice and hates theft in a burnt offering"? Right? Why does God hate theft in a burnt offering? Mashal l'melech basar v'dam shehaya over al beit hameches. So apparently, We can understand this by analogy to a human king who is walking past or traveling past a toll station. Amar lavadav tnu meches lamochsim. So he said to his servants, go pay the toll. Amrulo. So they said to him, "Va'lo kol meches kulo shelchahi." They said, well, that's kind of silly because it's your money. We're giving it to them. It will still be you get all the tolls. Why do you need to like take money out of your right pocket and stick it into your left pocket? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Amar lehem. So he said to them, "Mimeni yilmedu kol ovrei drachim." He said, because I'll be a good example and people will learn from me when they're traveling, and then they won't try to avoid paying tolls. Because they'll see, this is paying the toll is royal behavior. Even the king pays tolls, so I want to pay the toll too. Avakadosh Baruch Hu Amar, Ani Hashem soneh gazel ba'avla be'ola. Sorry, God said, I am Hashem. I hate theft in a burnt offering. Mimeni yilmedu banai, so my children will learn from me. V'yavrichu atzmam min hagazel, and they'll stay away from theft. Now, that sounds a lot like we're supposed to avoid receiving stolen property, even if it does currently belong to the person trying to sell it to us. And that might, in fact, be the moral lesson there. But it sounds like the sort of ancillary lesson that we're learning is that God doesn't like stolen things, and God would like us not to like stolen things. And from that, we get that God does not want us to use a stolen lulav, even when the lulav doesn't need to belong to us, even if there's been yeush, and so technically the lulav does belong to us. It doesn't actually matter who the lulav belongs to. God just like thinks that theft is gross, and he doesn't want us to do mitzvahs using stolen stuff.
I just want to say, I wish they taught me this thing about this clause like way back, because I've heard my whole life from the Tanakh of like the sacrifice idea of like not using like like that whole thing like in the Nevi'im, like I don't want your sacrifices if they're like corrupt or whatever. And I don't know if it's from there, but something, I think because of all this reasoning, it caused me to spend like 5 or 6 hours or more on purchases on Amazon, like researching where they come from, if they come from China or not, because China is a corrupt government and some of this, they don't have so many regulations and all this stuff. So it wasted a lot of my time. And anyways, my grandmother's like, everything comes from the earth anyways, some people told me in the family, like you can never like really get down to it. But
I think it's very honorable to try to avoid stolen property, to try to avoid things that were produced using corrupt or inappropriate practices. That's absolutely an honorable thing to do. But it might not be illegal.
It's not practical.
Is that an adult or a kid?
I agree it's important, but I'm saying it's not necessarily practical and possible. So I wish they would have taught me this earlier. That maybe is what I'm trying to say. It might help me in life a little bit.
Okay, yes, John.
If there is a willow growing in a public area, if I take it, am I stealing it?
I think it depends on what the conventions are in your location. So that's going to depend on what city you're in and whose property it's on, that sort of thing. But it is, that certainly can be a concern depending on the situation. Okay, so coming back here. Okay, Itmar Nami. It was also said, Amar Rabbi Ami, Yavesh Pasul Mipnei Shein Hadar. Rabbi Ami said the dried lulav is invalid because it's not beautiful. Gazul Pasul Mishum Dahavali Mitzvah Haba Be'evet. And the stolen one is invalid because it is a mitzvah that is done by doing a sin. Upliga the Rabbi Yitzchak. And it must be that when Rabbi Ami said this, he was disagreeing with this guy named Rabbi Yitzchak, who in fact turns out is actually named Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani. The Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani Amar Shmuel Lo Shanu Ela B'Yom Tov Rishon, because Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani apparently talking about our Mishnah said in the name of Shmuel, they were only talking about the first day of Sukkot. Aval biyom tov sheni mitoch sheyotzei b'shaul yotzei nami b'gazul. But Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani says on the second day of Sukkot, since you could use a borrowed lulav, you can also use a stolen lulav. So until this point in the Gemara, everybody had agreed that you can't use a stolen lulav on the second day of Sukkot, and that the reason was because it comes from a sin. But Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani has just disagreed. Mativ Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, whose name is weirdly almost exactly the opposite of the guy he's disagreeing with. I don't know if
Right. That's very good.
So he challenged Rav Yitzchak Bar Nachmani with a Breita. No, actually, I think it might be a line from our Mishnah. Lulav hagazul v'hayavesh pasul. A stolen or dry lulav is invalid. Hashaul kasher, but it doesn't mention borrowed lulavs, so it must be that a borrowed lulav is acceptable. Okay, so now we need to find a time when a lulav that is borrowed is okay, but a borrowed lulav that is stolen is not okay. Okay, emat. So when would that be? Ilem b'yom tov rishon. If you say it's the first day of Sukkot, haktiv lachem mishalachem v'haylav didehu. Well, it can't be the first day of Sukkot because it says it has to be yours. And this lulav, this borrowed lulav, is not his. El lulav b'yom tov sheni. It must, in fact, be talking about the second day of Sukkot. Viktani gazul pasul. And it says on the, it says in the Mishnah, but you can't use a stolen lulav. So it must be that the Mishnah means that there is a time when you're not allowed to use a lulav that doesn't when you are allowed to use a lulav that doesn't belong to you, hence you can use the borrowed lulav, but you can't use a stolen lulav. And that would be not just hypothetically disagreeing with Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani, but explicitly disagreeing with him, because his whole logic why you could use a stolen lulav was, well, you could use a borrowed one. And this seems to be explicitly saying that the stolen and the borrowed operate on different reasons, and there's a time when you can use a borrowed, but you can't use a stolen. So this would contradict him. But nah, we could read it a different way. Le'olam biyom tov rishon. In fact, it might be that the whole thing is talking about the first day of Sukkot. Velomi baya kamar, and it's talking about in the style of lomi baya. That is to say, I don't need to tell you, or needless to say, or it isn't necessary to say. Lomi baya shaul. It's not necessary to tell you that you can't use a borrowed lulav didehu, which isn't his. Aval gazul emastam gzela yeush bailimhu v'chadidedam. But I might have said about the stolen lulav that the default assumption, the default position of a stolen object is probably the owners have given up. And so kidide dami, and so it's as if it's his. So you might have thought that stolen isn't a problem, because most of the time, most stolen objects do in fact belong to the thief. So you can assume that that's true of this one also. And so you might have thought that even on the first day of Sukkot, you could use a stolen lulav because you could assume it's yours. Kamash Malan, so it's coming to tell you that in fact on the first day of Sukkot, you can't use your stolen lulav because maybe it's not yours. And you can't use this logic of, well, probably they gave up already. And if we do that interpretation, then Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Nachmani can still hold his position that anytime you can use a borrowed lulav, you can also use a stolen lulav, and then we actually have a real machloket Tanaim about how to read the Mishnah. Amar lahu Rav Huna lahanhu avankri. So Rav Huna had the following conversation with some traders. These seem to be people who are reselling Arba Minim. Whether they also resell other things is not clear to me. That doesn't come into the story. Kisav nitu asa migoyim. When you buy myrtle, when you buy hadassim from non-Jews, lo tegazazu atun. Don't cut it yourself. Ela ligzazuha inhu v'yahaveluchu. But let them cut it, and then they can give it to you. My tama, why is that? Stam goyim gazlane arta ninhu. The presumption is that the default position of non-Jews, at least non-Jews in Babylonia where Rav Huna is, and maybe it's non-Jews in general, is that they use land without properly getting permission for it. They are thieves of land. Vikarka ena nigzelet, and real estate can't be stolen, which is not to say that it isn't possible for me to, at using violence, force somebody else to leave their land and then use it instead of them and not let them back on, right? That's certainly an act of stealing. But it's not stealing in the sense that it doesn't ever make it mine, right? In the way that movable property becomes eventually the property of the thief through Yeush or through changing the object, as we'll see that option in a second. That can't happen with real estate because the real estate doesn't go anywhere. It's always right there where it started. And so we don't think that owners ever give up on it. I'm sure there are messages here, both for our attachment to the land of Israel over the course of thousands of years and to other people's attachment over shorter periods of time to that land and other land. When people feel like land has been stolen from them, they do not give up. And so you can't presume that the land itself now belongs to the person holding it. So what we're trying to make happen here, hold on a second.
Okay, sorry.
Hilkach ligzezuha inhu. So let the non-Jews who are selling the myrtles, let them cut it themselves. And so then when the hadassim go from being part of the ground where they weren't subject to becoming the property of the thief to being movable property where they will be subject to that, and then they will become the property of the person who cut it, who has stolen it, and then you could buy it from them. So at the time when the Yeush happens, it'll be in the hands of the non-Jews who are selling the hadassim. And then it will successfully change possession when they sell it to you, and then it will be yours. That seems to be what Rav Huna is saying, is that the only way that you're going to end up being the owner is if you make the non-Jews convert it to movable property instead of real estate before they give it to you, so that then it will be at least mostly theirs before they sell it to you, and it will be all yours when you buy it. But they say, sof kigazu avankuri. So in the end, suppose that the traders had themselves cut the hadassim, then the Yeush would happen while the traders are holding the myrtles. And then Vishinur should be done. And then when we buy the hadassim from the traders, it would properly transfer into our hands, and they would be kosher to use in our lulav by the time we get them. So that can't be the case because then it wouldn't be necessary. So it says lo tzricha. So it must in fact be that the case this is necessary for is behoshana de avankari gufayhu. That Rav Huna was talking about the myrtles that the traders themselves are going to use in their own lulav, and so then they need to have acquired it legitimately from somebody who owned it. So they need the non-Jews to cut it first, so that the non-Jew will now be the thief who will now properly own it, and then they can buy it from him or her. So it suggests then velik nuha b'shinui maaseh. Well, okay, but why can't they cut it themselves, and now they're the thieves? But then they could become the proper owners by changing it, right? Which is another way that a thief can become the real owner of the object is if they modify it. And so it must be that Rav Huna thinks kasavar lulav ein tzarich eged. It must be that Rav Huna thinks that a lulav doesn't need to be tied to the hadassim and the aravot. V'im tim zilomar lulav tzarich eged. And if Rav Huna does think that they need to be tied together, then maybe he thinks shinui hachozer lebriatohu. That would be, just binding the species together is reversible. You could just, cut the piece of lulav or whatever it is that you tied them together with, and they go back to being separate. It's not a permanent change, so it doesn't change its ownership. And a reversible change is not really a change. Okay, but then veliknuha b'shinui hashem. So sometimes you can become the owner of something by having it change what it's called, even if it didn't undergo a permanent physical change. Demikara havale asa, because originally it was called a myrtle, v'hashta hoshana, and now it's part of a lulav. So when your hadassim were separate before you stuck them into your lulav holder, they were hadassim. Now you stuck them into your lulav holder, and people call that whole construction, the lulav plus the hadassim plus the aravot, we call that a lulav. Or apparently in the Gemara they called it a hoshana. Doesn't matter. It's as long as it's a different name than what you started with. So they say, nah, that's not going to work because meikara nami la'asa hoshana karaluhu. Because sometimes people call just plain hadassim, they'll call that a hoshana, which we don't usually do anymore, but we do still call just willow branches a hoshana. When we use them on Hoshana Rabbah, for example, right? The rabbi will announce, right? Hoshanot are $5. They're in the bucket in the back of the shul, or whatever. Put your $5 into this box. And what he means by Hoshanot are these like bundles of willow branches. So the word seems to have survived about willow branches in our usage, but it no longer describes either a lulav or a bundle of hadassim, even though it seems to have done so then. In any case, the net result here is that maybe if the trader had been doing something to the myrtles that either physically changed them permanently or changed what name people called them, maybe they would have become the legitimate owner. But since they're not doing either of those things, what they need to do instead is get the previous owner to be the halachic owner so they can buy it from them legitimately, and then they can be the legitimate owner, even to use it themselves, not just to sell it to other people. Which in the end, when you have a dispute like that, and then you have a story, and the story clearly follows one side and not the other, usually that means that we are following the other side. It would seem like as of right now, so far, the law is that you can't use a stolen arba medium. Let's assume it applies equally to all four parts on any day of Sukkot, even though the obligation to own it yourself only applies on the first day. It seems like we don't rule, at least as of right now, like Rav Yitzchak Bar Nachmani. Okay, are there questions? Yes, John.
So if I steal a lulav
Mhm.
and sell it to someone
Mhm.
and buy it back from them, is it still a stolen lulav?
I don't know. The outcome, it seems like if you were an unknowing participant in this scheme, then it sounds like from Rav Huna's story that your selling it to somebody else would make it legal to use it. If you're a knowing participant, then it sort of sounds from the Gemara's analysis of Rav Huna like we would still allow it. I don't like the idea. Maybe we'll get to it explicitly later, but I have to say I don't like the idea, but I see your point. And yeah, the answer is maybe.
Um, I also have a question, like, I guess my question is, so I don't fully get why they think that it's impossible. Like the way I understood what you're saying is that it seems that the only way for Jewish people, I guess, in Babylonia, or one of the I guess the likely way that they can get a non-stolen lulav only is if the previous owners um, cut the branches, various branches themselves, and then sell it. And like
Well, if
I
you're
don't even
buying,
understand that assumption, because like couldn't Jews happen to own a tree
yeah,
and a
so
land
I
also
think
as well?
if you're buying myrtles from or aravot or lulav or etrog or whatever from Jews who grew it, and the Jew tells you that it's not stolen and they're, a decent person, then yes, I think that's probably totally fine. If you
Well,
grow
and
your
also
own stuff,
Babylonia, they're in
totally.
exile, so they're probably not so,
But
that's part of the problem. I think
my
us Jews were in exile, so a lot of times we don't own things like trees and stuff like that in Babylonia, probably.
it's possible, it's even possible that there's a, specific myrtle farm that was set up by some non-Jews who are sort of shady that Ravuna doesn't trust, and that he was responding to like a very specific situation in his time and place, and that it's not about non-Jews in general. I don't know. I don't know. But yes,
So,
if you had reason to believe that the farmer had legitimate hold on their own farm, then I think this would all be fine. You could just buy it at a farmer's market. Like I don't. I think this is
okay,
because we are suspicious of these particular people.
all right. So I guess so. Can I ask you? Can you please summarize like the two opinions? So like one of them thinks that you need to for the non-Jews have to cut it off themselves and then sell it, and then the
So
second opinion is that you don't
okay,
have
so
to do that.
as far as that, we really only had one opinion, which was
Mm,
Rav Huna, and we haven't seen anyone disagree with him, at least not yet. That if you're
mhm,
buying from non-Jews, then there should either the non-Jews should cut the thing before they sell it to you, or at least you should buy it secondhand. But
mhm,
so that you're not the person who cut it shouldn't also be the person using it as Arban
right.
Minim, is what Rav
Mhm,
Huna seemed to.
right.
The machloket that we saw was whether you can use a definitely stolen Arba Minim on the second or third or fourth day of Sukkot, right?
Right.
Rav Yitzchak Bar Nachmani thinks that you can, with your own hands, actually steal someone's Arba Minim and use them to do the mitzvah while they're definitely still stolen, and the other
Right.
person that still wants them back, they can
Right.
be standing there yelling, "Give me back my etrog!" And
Right.
Bar Nachmani is like, "No, it looks like a mitzvah to me," as long
Right.
as it's not the first day of Sukkot.
Mm,
Whereas everybody else seems to think that God really doesn't like mitzvahs with stolen stuff. And
right.
you shouldn't do mitzvahs with stolen stuff at all in general. It has nothing to do with the need for a lulav to belong to you on the first day of Sukkot.
Right, because it seems like the person, I think it was Rav Yitzchak Bar Nachmani, the one who agrees that, who thinks that you're allowed to do with stolen stuff, is just, it's like pure logic in the sense that if you could, right, the reasoning, the proof is that if you could do it with the borrows, you should also be allowed to do it with the stolen, because you never know if something that you borrow is also stolen. I thought that was his legal jump.
That's it. I think he doesn't buy the logic of stolen being its own problem. He thinks it's just a subset of the category of things that don't belong to you. And anytime you could do a mitzvah with something
Oh,
that doesn't, he thinks it's okay to use stolen. Whereas everybody
right.
else is like, God hates theft. But he doesn't seem to buy that.
You're right, but I'm saying his logic, it actually makes sense to me, because it's like, how are you gonna know? Like if you go to a shul or you go to some place and exactly like you're doing something that doesn't belong to you, like if you're like even walking in Manhattan and like the Chabadniks come to you and they're like, "Do you need a shake lulav today?" And you're like, "Yeah, sure," and then you borrow it from them. You have no idea who these people are. Like you don't know where they got it from. Like it makes sense to me that like once you're allowed to do it with things that are not yours, then then it would be more lenient, like in the Torah wise, for it to be stolen goods. But I
Could
hear
be.
what you're saying. Like I hear his opinion. I guess I hear both sides of it. It makes both opinions make sense, which is good.
All right. Okay, so
Yeah.
I will see all you guys next Monday. Have a lovely week.
You too. Bye.